distinguished professors and doctors, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, are you having fun? It is a huge honour and pleasure for me, first of all, to endure the chairmanship of Madhav Kandekar, a chairmanship so invisible that he isn't even on the platform. But he is a great man who's been working on climate change and some of the nonsense for many, many years, and it's a great pleasure that he is in charge of us today. And I'm honoured also to share the platform both with Barry Brill and with Sebastian Lüning, both of whom are doughty fighters, valiant for truth in the climate change cause. Let's give them all a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Now, my job today is to take the side opposite to that of Barry Brill, who is taking the relaxed, nothing to see here, move along side on what might happen at Paris. I'm going to go into a little bit of the detail on what has been in the various treaty drafts that led up to the Paris train wreck, and to indicate what I think they're going to try to do there. A lot of it they have already done, but they've done it by stealth, and you might not have noticed they've done it. And Paris is, in effect, going to be the crowning glory on a long, patient, and increasingly stealthy program of transfer of power and wealth and bureaucratic organization and, ultimately, government from elected hands here to unelected hands at the UN. So we start then with the Copenhagen train wreck. You've heard a little bit about this already from Barry Brill. What I'm going to do is to look at what was in the Copenhagen Treaty draft. Now, I used to do a certain amount of treaty drafting for Her Majesty's government, and I have never before seen the word government used in a treaty in a context in which it is plain that a global government was intended. You will see it here in paragraph 38 of Annex 1 to the draft Treaty of Copenhagen, which was to be found on the UN's website on the 15th of September 2009, which is where Willie Soon, a worthy honoree here today, found it and let me know about it. It's an extraordinary revelation of what is really being attempted here, and I thought that rather than just talking in vague terms about the New World Order and word government, I would show you the actual quotation from the treaty draft. There it is. And here again, you'll see the government is referred to, this time again in paragraph 38, and you'll see that they were being given, the government will be ruled by a bureaucratic entity, the Conference of the Parties, elected by no one. And the voters were going to have no say in any of this at all, and this government was going to have enormous powers. It was also going to subordinate the free market to public policies, which effectively means government by diktat from this new government entity. It was going to be very expensive indeed. Barry Brill has just shown you the figures for how little the UN now says it's going to cost the world if we do nothing at all about climate change. It's 0.2 to 2.0% of GDP if by 2100 all we get is 2.5 Celsius of warming, and we're not going to see anything like that. And here you can see they're asking for a 2% of GDP tax on the wealthy nations, and a financial transactions tax of another 2% on top of that, which would pretty much close down the financial markets worldwide. They work on basis points which are 1/100th of 1%, and here they are suddenly being told they've got to pay a 2% tax on each financial transaction. The economic illiteracy and also the economic ambition to centralize economic power that is evident in this treaty draft has not gone away. And the fact that that draft failed, largely thanks to the intervention of China, does not mean that they won't try to bring it back. Here are the democratic provisions for the election of this government, and because I'm very meticulous, I have listed them here in full. And when I first revealed the existence of this treaty in the United States on the 14th of October 2009, just a few weeks before the Copenhagen conference, somebody filmed the 4-minute peroration of my speech in which I described the details of this treaty and put it up on YouTube. Just they used their mobile phone to film it. And that has now been seen, in fact it was seen at the time by 2.5 million people. It's gone up to 2.7 million now. Interestingly, the forces of darkness did not want this to go viral. And when it had got to 2.5 million hits in 2 weeks, it's the fastest, still to this day, the fastest YouTube platinum for any political speech, they put up a dozen bogus YouTube pages full of gibberish, but containing somewhere within them the words Monckton video. Now that's cheap. But what they then did was they paid each of the search engines to make sure that those dozen pages of gibberish that nobody could read, it was just nonsense, were elevated above the video that everybody wanted to see that had 2.5 million hits already. I got a phone call from Texas A&M University from a professor there who specializes in monitoring the internet. He said, "They've done this to you." I said, "Well, how much did it cost?" He said, "Putting up the pages next to nothing, paying the search engines to advance the rankings so that the viral chain was broken," which it was immediately when they did this. Within a day, it had all stopped. He said that will have cost not less, and this he said was a conservative estimate, than $250,000. I don't know who did that. I don't care who did that. What I do care is if they're spending that kind of money trying to keep secret the details of what is in these treaties, then we would not like what we would find therein. And that is going to become apparent as I go through the next conference, which was at Cancun in 2010. And here they began the process of simply building the world government that had not been voted through at Copenhagen. And here you will see the bureaucratic organizations for the centralization of both not only environmental power over governments, but also economic power in the hands of these interesting new centralized bureaucracies. And these, and these, and these, and indeed these, and these, and these, and these, and these, and these. Almost 1,000 new bureaucracies were called into being at Cancun, almost invisibly. Only one website, What's Up With That, Anthony Watts is here somewhere, actually reported that this is what they had done. Not one of the 2,000 journalists at that conference reported any of the conclusions of the conference. But we did. And then we go to Durban. Well, at least I tried to go to Durban, but on the first day of the conference, I had a stand-up row with the head of the World Meteorological Organization, Dr. Michel Jarroux, because I said he had got a bogus graph on the front of the 1999 WMO report on the state of the climate, and it was time that he cleaned his act up, and he had me thrown out of the conference. Speaking truth to power can sometimes be painful. However, I decided what we would do is to hire a plane and drop me over the conference from a height of 10,000 feet with a skydiving parachute, not without one. And here I am jumping out of the plane. And if you're going to take a selfie, make sure you take an interesting one. And as one of the journalists who reported this event in the local paper said, "The sky is raining Monktons, and this is because of global warming." So, now the Durban draft, they produce every year a thing called the Draft Conclusions of the Chair, which are the main decisions and outputs of the conference. And this document was available again to all 2,000 journalists who came to that conference. And here are just some of the barking mad provisions that were in that draft. You cannot credit it, but these were all actually there. I've kept a copy of it. The rights of legal personality were going to be accorded to Mother Earth. They were going to establish an international climate court, which was directed against Western nations only, and against people who skydived into their conferences. They were going to cut CO2 concentration to around 210 parts per million by volume, which is roughly halves it, and the effect of that would have been to cause mass loss of plant biomass, and it would have caused widespread extinctions both of plant and animal species. They actually seriously advocated this course of action. That wasn't all. They were going to say that Western greenhouse gas emissions were to peak at once and were not to be allowed to rise any further. They also engagingly said, and this shows the lack of quantitative sense, which is what we here find so difficult in those with whom we debate on this issue, that Western nations must cut emissions by more than 100%. The phrase more than 100% actually appears in the treaty draft. They said that Western inventors' patent rights in third world nations were to be scrapped. So any invention that I make, and I've got quite a few patents to my name, in future I would have to hand these over for free to nations which could then sell them back into the Western nations, and I would get no royalties at all. And it was Al Gore who had that one put in. He's been on that for years. They said that shipping and aviation fuels were to be included within the scope of the treaty for the first time, and there was to be, you'll be glad to hear about this, equitable access to the global atmospheric space, whatever that may mean. They said that defence forces were to be scrapped because of the impact they have on climate change. This was a heroically lunatic document, and when I wrote about it, I couldn't understand why not one of the so-called journalists who went to this conference, 2,000 of them, carried a single word of this treaty draft anywhere in any news medium, anywhere in the world. So I put this up on What's Up With That, and we got a phone call the next day from WordPress. And WordPress hosts 500,000 blog postings every day, 500,000 on all subjects. And they ring the person every day who gets the most hits out of those 500,000 blog postings. And it was this one. And I was interviewed by a journalist earlier in this conference who said, you know, the fact is the readers aren't interested in what's in these treaties and all that nerdy, boring stuff. What they're interested in is how much you're being paid by the Koch brothers. And I said, that's easy. I've never met them. They love my work, but they've never sent me a check yet. And I said, as for my check from ExxonMobil, this month it didn't come yet again. So this was the lunacy, and 500,000 blog postings. This was the one that was read by more than any other blog posting, because people wanted to know what was being done in their name, and they wanted to hear about this extraordinarily lunatic series of proposals. And there is the WordPress result. So now we go to the Qatar catastrophe in 2012. I can't think why you're laughing. This was very serious. I think you're probably looking at the picture in the top left-hand corner. That is me dressed in Arab headdress. And this was because in the Arab world, there is an absolute rule that if you are given hospitality, you must show appreciation for it. And I was given this outfit by a businessman staying in the same hotel as me. He was a very distinguished Qatari delegate to the conference there, the UN conference. He gave me this, and the following day, by the strict obligations of Arab hospitality, I was obliged to wear it. I felt remarkably stupid, but it did have some entertaining moments, because I was due to be interviewed by a rather serious young journalist from the Times, and we'd arranged to meet at a particular place in the conference. He walked straight past me. So I said, "Salam alaikum," and he jumped out of his skin. So the draft conclusions by the chair in that conference, I went as usual to the documentation centre to ask for this document. But they had remembered what had been done to them the previous year, because at Durban, when I had published the draft conclusions by the chair, the humiliation was so intense that within 24 hours of that publication, they had to drop 50% of the 150-page document that they were going to get the nations to agree to. They had to scrap it. And so they didn't want that to happen again. So when I said, "Can I have, please, the draft conclusions by the chair?" they looked at me as though they'd never heard of any such thing, and smiled that little bureaucratic smile, which meant, "Gotcha this time, mate." And so I said, "We don't know what you're talking about." And of course they knew perfectly well what I was talking about. But I did get my say at that conference because I found myself sitting in one of the delegates' chairs. They were very comfortable, and most of the delegates by the fag end of the conference were still partying in the souk. So eventually the chairman, right at the end of the conference, he said, could you please, does anybody want to say anything that hasn't said anything so far, but you must represent a group? So I thought, quick, what kind of group can we have? So I said, yes, I would like to speak on behalf of the Asian Coastal Cooperation Initiative. I was rather pleased at having thought that up on the spur of the moment. And so I was given the microphone, and I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but there hasn't been any global warming for 16 years. And even if there had been, it's cheaper to let it happen than to do anything about it. So let's call the scientists and economists in and just check stuff out a bit before we carry on, just to make sure these conferences are heading in the right direction. And the booing and hissing that arrived immediately after that. And the official propaganda line is this because they knew I wasn't a real delegate and they were furious. Actually, it was because what I said was bringing their gravy train to an end and tipping it firmly into the gulch, and they knew it. So they were very angry. It was just as though you were at a pop concert at which Justin Dribbler was due to appear and they'd announced he wasn't coming on. They were furious. So, but then they banned me for life from UN conferences. They didn't want any more embarrassments like the Durban one. And so they banned me for life because they said I had impersonated the Burmese delegate. Do I look Burmese? Do I sound Burmese? Did I dress Burmese? The chairman of the conference actually said he knew perfectly well I wasn't from Burma. So, of course, there was no impersonation, but they were glad to see the back of me, and I have to say, I of them. So here are the final decisions adopted by COP18 and COP8. You will find the link there. You try to use that link, and it refers you back to the same link. You won't be allowed to see the conclusions of that conference, nor of the Warsaw Waffle Fest the following year. And so what should we then do? I conclude on this note. What are we going to do before the Paris Piffle Fest of 2015? Now, you can see what they're up to. They're building these bureaucracies. They're transferring all power into their hands. They're going to try and get a binding treaty at Paris. And they've been going round, climate change ambassadors, Al Gore's been doing it. We've got a ludicrous figure called Sir David King, who is a misplaced research chemist, going round on behalf of the British government as a climate change ambassador. And they're nobbling governments one by one, and they're spending the whole of the next 2 years doing it. And they will be convincing them. The only one so far that is standing out, Mr. Brill will be delighted to know, is Australia. Because they reckon that Canada will have gone, but Australia is standing out. So, sir, I hope when you get back, you will first of all convey my kindest sentiments to your Prime Minister, a very distinguished and great man, and give him this advice, that given that there has been no temperature change for the last 17 years, 10 months, we need to make sure that there is a get-out clause in any so-called binding treaty that they may make. They are going to try not to put one in. If there's one thing you can do, sir, to make absolutely sure that we do not get locked into a treaty that we may later regret and then find we cannot get out of, you must include a provision like the one we managed to get put into the Kyoto Protocol. You see it here, it's Article 27, which allows any state party to that treaty to give a year's notice and then simply leave the whole nonsense. Sir, if you make sure that he makes sure that that goes into the treaty draft, whether or not Australia has any intention of signing it, if you put that in the treaty draft, they are doomed even if everybody passes it and even if they sign it, because the temperature will continue not to rise at the rate they said, and therefore people, if this provision is put in that treaty, will be free to leave. That's my recommendation. God bless you all and thank you.